let's talk about some of the other things that tie in. For example, you talked about the 490 years.
Yeah.
That pointed to Jesus. And then you've talked about the 6,000 years and a seventh, which again is a deduction and an observation from the patterns of Scripture.
Right.
Okay. Can you tie those two together?
Yes, remarkably they can be. Very nicely.
Okay.
Appreciate the question.
That was a softball question.
Yes, it was. Yeah. From the time of the 1940s, there was a gentleman named Edwin Thiel. He was a scholar, a researcher of antiquities, a professor, but also a deeply thinking Christian man.
Yeah. And he was probably, did he come from an Adventist background?
He did.
He did.
He
Okay.
did. And so he had some attention to the prophecies, but he didn't write so much about that. He wrote about his historical research.
Right.
But he was able to go back through the testimony of Kings and Chronicles and show how the double thread of testimony about the kings of the 10-tribe kingdom of Samaria and the 2 tribes of Judah intertwined in a unique way to establish the history of Israel all the way back to King Ahab. From King Ahab back to Solomon is a very straight jump. Mm-hmm. So this resolved a lot of complexity in the Old Testament. And then when he resolved that, only from the Hebrew Old Testament, then because he was a professor of antiquities, he was able to show that this exactly paralleled the history of the Assyrian Empire back to Ahab.
Yes.
Because Ahab is mentioned in the Assyrian records, and they had a conflict between Ahab. Anyway,
Yeah.
so you have now 4 threads of testimony: the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, the Assyrian king list, and the Assyrian eponym list, which is a list of every single year in the record of the Assyrian Empire.
Right.
Those 4 exactly meld all the way back to Ahab.
Yeah.
By doing that and then jumping from Ahab back to Solomon in the Scripture, you can establish that the date when Solomon founded his temple, 1 Kings 6:1, we laid the foundation, was 966 BC. Mm-hmm. Now, I say that glibly, but I've studied it deeply. I'm persuaded to the very year that he's correct.
Yes.
Now, the NIV Study Bible these days will put a footnote at 1 Kings 6:1 referring to his work and saying 966.
Right.
And some people that refer to this say, approximately. There's a gentleman in England, Kenneth Kitchen, very elderly, a revered Egyptologist. He wrote a paper on this once, reviewing Edwin Thiel's work. He says a lot of people consider it maybe possible, maybe tentative, maybe. He says they haven't read his work. Yeah. They haven't really gone into detail.
Yeah.
So he's got it solved.
Yeah.
So this is the consensus of a lot of people that actually believe in the history of the Old Testament.
Right.
Now, if you don't really credit the history of the Old Testament, okay, then we're not talking to the right subject here. But if you believe in the history, you can date Solomon's temple to 966. Now, why is that so meaningful for the span of 6,000? Because it's a very simple matter. To go to the Hebrew Old Testament from Genesis forward to Solomon, count up the years of the record, they're all there. Mm-hmm. It's 2,992 years. Add that to 966 BC, you now have a starting date to the very year for Adam. Mm-hmm. Calculate 7,000 years forward, and we know when the end of the 1,000 years will be.
Yeah.
Back up 1,000, we know when the beginning will be. Okay, now I get into trouble on this. A lot of people don't like to project into the future, but the numbers are there.
Yeah.
If you use 966 BC, that I didn't come up with, but I certainly have researched and verified, and then you add the Hebrew Old Testament, we know the 6,000 years from Adam are going to end just a generation from us today.
What year?
2043, to be precise.
Okay, so, but that doesn't explain where the connection with Jesus and the 70 weeks is.
Correct. Okay, so we take the next step.
So,
7,000 years would end in 3043 then. Now, you know that the creative days in Genesis were an evening and a morning, an evening and a morning. And this 7,000 years is the last creative day, the one in which God rested because the literal creation was complete. And therefore, it naturally fits into 2 periods, a dark period and a bright period, the evening and the morning. Well, if you segregate 7,000 years into 2 periods, each of them is 3,500 years. It so happens that exactly at the midway point of this 7,000, exactly ending the first 3,500, was 458 BC.
458 BC.
Precisely the year that the 70-week prophecy counting to the redemption of Jesus at Calvary began to count.
Yes.
So right in the midst of the 7,000 years of God's plan, he begins the count toward redemption. There's a scripture that kind of expresses this thought in Habakkuk. In the midst of the years, in wrath, because the wrath of God is still poured out on all flesh, as Paul says, remember mercy. And right in the middle, he mercifully begins to count the years toward the redemption. Then the first stage of redemption, what we call the gospel age. Then the second age of redemption, the millennial age. It all begins right in the center. So the fact that the 70-week prophecy, beyond peradventure, begins in 458 BC, and that exactly synchronizes with the midst of 7,000 years. Okay, we're talking synchronicity here that engages the attention.
Yeah.
Now, can I prove it had to be this way? No, we're on the terms of faith now. We see something in the scripture where the years we can demonstrate, and then the connections just spring forward.
Right.
This is remarkable.
Yeah.
But it's only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of thing that time prophecy does for us.
All right, good. Well, that's a good place to pause, and tomorrow we will continue from there. I think that's a good breaking point.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. All right, so David, thank you. We will get into much more depth and many more prophecies in the following episodes on this topic.
Good.
Thanks.